If you want to mark in your New Testaments, Hebrews chapter 13, we'll be there in a moment. I want to give a plug to our all-comers class for just a minute. It begins on Tuesday, of course. It will run through the week before Thanksgiving and meets in the Adult 2 classroom back here in the back. Let me encourage you to take part in that class if you can at all. I know it's something additional to your schedule, and it means another commitment of time. But if you've never been to or attended the all-comers class, I'd like to challenge you to give it a try. I think you'll like it. The class, generally, we have 25 to 30 in attendance. We have the class is live streamed on Facebook, just like our worship services are. And there are some at home that follow it and are faithful in doing so. And if you can follow the class that way, then I hope that you will. Materials are on Linda's desk to be picked up, which we will start, Lord willing, Tuesday morning with those materials. And if you haven't picked yours up as yet, there are still several copies on her desk. Hope you'll take advantage of it and follow along with us if you can. If you need a dose of encouragement, come to class. If you need a dose of encouragement, watch us on Facebook. I hope that we'll be able to supply the need that we all have in that regard. Hebrews 13 verse 1. Sometimes it's funny how a verse will stick in your mind and a question will attach itself to the verse. And the verse itself is very simple. And the verse is not isolated. It fits a context. And I want us to follow that context a little bit tonight to watch how it plays out. But the verse that I've chosen for my thoughts is very simple. Let brotherly love continue. Which would suggest that brotherly love has been in place. It just needs to stay in place. So the question in my mind is there the possibility that brotherly love might not continue? Is there a remote possibility that something could happen that would destroy brotherly love, interrupt brotherly love, run interference to brotherly love in one individual's heart or perhaps in a group of people, let's say in a congregation such as Maple Vale? Is that a remote possibility? Well, let brotherly love continue, okay? If you keep in mind the book of Hebrews, the reason for which the book was written, apparently, was some very difficult times when those who had obeyed the gospel were slipping back into Judaism, apparently in great numbers. Some were falling away, leaving the faith. And the writer of the book is trying to instill people with the encouragement to stay, to remain with the Lord, to reassess their values, to keep studying, and along with those hardships that affected a great many people, when things like that are as difficult as they are, sometimes love is affected. Where people were leaving the faith in the book of Hebrews, not only were they departing from the faith, they were departing from love, which is part of the faith in Jesus Christ. There has to be the faith, there has to be love. These two things work together. So in my mind then, it seems this is why the writer to the book of the book of Hebrews, right at the end of the book, says, let brotherly love continue in spite of the hardships and those who have fallen away and those he's trying to reclaim and to keep in place. Let brotherly love continue. Okay. Do we love one another the way Jesus loved his church? Think about it. How did Jesus love his church? Well, in Ephesians 5:25 through 27, Paul speaking to husbands, saying, husbands, love your wives. But notice the pattern that he uses to encourage husbands love their wives, even as Christ also loved the church, gave himself for it. All right, that's a monumental love, isn't it? Do we love the church the way Jesus did? Would you give yourself for it? Do you love it that much? Do we love the brotherhood the way the early Christians did? For example, in the book of Acts, and there are so many examples in the book of Acts, but in Acts chapter 12, when one of their number, Peter, was imprisoned, the brethren prayed for him. They didn't just pray for him, but they prayed constantly for him. In Acts 12 and verse 5. And then as you read through the chapter just a little bit, there's the implication in your mind that these brethren, they prayed all night long for Peter. And their prayers were answered, and the apostle was released, much to their surprise. And why should we be surprised if the Lord answers our prayers? But they loved one another to the extent that when one of their number was taken into custody, they prayed for him all night long. In Galatians 4 and verse 15, Paul, in writing to the churches of Galatia, in that particular verse indicated something of the relationship that he had with those brethren. He said, you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me. Now, commentators like to make a point of that, to say, well, Paul, he had vision problems. I don't know if that's the case or not, but let's just use it to suggest that it says something about the love that brethren have for one another, that these brethren would have plucked out their eyes for Paul. That's a strong statement. It says a lot. Now, you can debate the reality of all of that. I don't care. That says something about love. Okay? And then, going back to the book of Acts. In chapter 20, in verse 34, when one of their number was leaving, and they realized that they would never see him again face to face, they wept openly. Must have been quite a scene. A demonstration of love, brotherly love for one another. I use these passages to suggest to you something of what brotherly love looks like and what it is to love one another. And the New Testament gives us a pretty clear picture of what that brotherly love entails. Do we love one another that way? Does love go beyond words to actions? We say love it's not an emotion, it's much more than that. And that's true. But still, there has to be a heart connection there to where love demonstrates itself in what we do and what we don't do. So there are actions that define love in the ways that these passages suggest to us how the early Christians loved one another. Do we love one another that way here at Maple Vale? In the broader picture, I realize that sometimes people of the world see things, hear things that aren't right. They see and hear brethren squabbling with one another, fighting with one another, dividing, and so forth. And their assessment of all of that is, well, if that's how you treat one another, I don't want any part of it. So they see what they consider hypocrisy, and it may be, may not be, but they've judged it as such, and they feel as though they're justified in saying, well, if that's what you call love, I don't want anything to do with that. Well, first of all, I'm sorry for the problems that result in someone's witnessing of such to draw such a conclusion. Secondly, whatever they judge hypocrisy to be does not alleviate them of the responsibility of obeying Jesus, because people are people and people have feet of clay. And yes, we should demonstrate what love is and what Jesus would have us to be at all times and all places, but people fail. And others judge us because of it. And they will be so strong as to say, if not to your face, sometimes on Facebook or some other social media, if that's the way you people are, I don't want anything to do with you. Sadly enough, sometimes we send out the wrong message. Our unity to one another should be such that it impresses those who are watching. That's what Jesus expected of his disciples, his apostles, John 17 and verse 21, that the world may believe on me through their word. All right? That's a powerful impact. That speaks of the power of unity, and it speaks of the power of love. Okay. But back to our text in Hebrews 13, verse 1. Let brotherly love continue. Let it endure, in other words. How did the writer of Hebrews express this in the verses that follow? Well, let's look at the examples that he gave. Let me move my marker. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing you have unwittingly entertained angels. In other words, Christians traveled from place to place. Missionaries, preachers, evangelists traveled. They didn't have hotels, motels, such as that. They went from place to place. Christians took care of one another. And in so doing, they entertained messengers, took care of messengers, preachers, evangelists. An example of brotherly love. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, and those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also, prisoners, those who are incarcerated because of their preaching of the gospel. Don't forget those people. It's evidence of love, loving one another. Marriage is also honorable among all. The bed undefiled, fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Love at home spills over into the love of the brethren. All right? It's evidenced in both places. Let your conduct be without covetousness, greed, and be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear. What can man do to me? Let love be evidenced in your life, your conduct. Don't let your life be evidenced by greed, covetousness. Be happy, content with what you've got. People see that. It sends a message, okay? Get along with one another. Love one another. Love the brethren. Remember those who rule over you, who have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith follow, considering the outcome of their conduct. All right, we remember elders that have made an impression upon us. They helped us. They guided us. They saved us from one problem and then another. Remember people like that, both living and dead. Don't forget them. Jesus Christ is the same, yesterday, today, and forever. And now notice the next point that he makes. Do not be carried about with various and strange teachings or doctrines. For it is good that the heart be established by grace, not with foods which have not profited those who have been occupied with them. We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. For the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing the reproach. I guess I could stop there just to show you how the thought of let brotherly love continue expresses itself, how the writer intended for it to be seen among others. And my point for us, and one of the ways in which brotherly love is so oftentimes railroaded, is to go back to verse 9. Do not be carried away by various and strange doctrines. I want us to think briefly tonight, if I can keep it briefly, and I'll try real hard. I want us to think about what brotherly love is not. What it is not. Okay? Brotherly love is not the world mentality that says, I'm okay, you're okay, we're all okay. The world mentality of I'm okay, you're okay is to say that, whatever anybody believes and whatever they do, it's all good and we should be tolerant of it and go along and get along and everything's all right. No, that's the world mentality. That's not the Lord's mentality. All right. So brotherly love is not closing our ears to doctrine, to teaching. As the point that was made by the writer in verse 9, do not be carried away by these things, false doctrines and teachings. We have to be in tune with the truth, to love the truth, Love those who teach it. Support those who teach it. We don't look the other way when something is wrong, when something is erroneous. As Jesus said, John 14 and verse 19, if you love me, then keep my commandments. Paul in 2 Corinthians 11 had to deal with false teachings and false doctrines. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I want you to notice a thought or two. Going back to 2 Corinthians 11, looking at verses, let's look at 3 and 4 initially. Paul took some criticism as an apostle. He had his enemies, just like all preachers do, I guess. And he was taken aback by how they could be so soft on false teachers and yet so hard on him. Pick it up at verse 3, if you will. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 3. But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he who comes preaches another Jesus, whom we've not preached, or if you receive a different spirit, which you've not received, or a different gospel, which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it. All right, here's what Paul's doing. He said, basically, he's saying, I'm surprised at you, brethren. You have criticized me all these years. False teachers have come along preaching a different Jesus, by a different spirit and a different gospel, and you have put up with it. And Paul says, I'm not. I'm not going to put up with it. He goes farther in the verses that follow, and I'll try to summarize it. He said, look, I've come to you and I've surrendered my rights as a preacher. I'm not making any claims on you. Financially speaking, there's no criticism to be had. I will speak out for you. I'll speak up for you. Why? Because in verse 11, I'll brag on you because I love you. Brotherly love in evidence. All right. Sometimes brotherly love has to manifest itself in hard times. Hard times in a congregation. Brotherly love raises its beautiful head and is seen. Paul didn't ignore, overlook, forget false teaching. He pointed it out. He said, I love you, brethren, anyway. False teaching is not failing to discipline when discipline is necessary. There are times when people need to be spiritually disciplined, and to look the other way and to ignore it does no one any favors. For example, in the passage that I'm open to, as I just noted with you, 2 Corinthians 11, and I mentioned to you verse 4 with regard to these problems, and Paul said, you've put up with all of this stuff, and he's having a hard time understanding why. I skipped down to verse 20. Here it is again. For you put up with it. If one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you on the face, you put up with all of this. Why? Hard to understand. If one needs discipline in life, spiritual discipline, moral discipline, it does no one any favors to ignore it. If somebody needs discipline, you take steps to get to them and to discipline them. That's how Jesus approached it. He approached it that way. Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. It's there for you to read, please. The example is, if your brother offends you, talk to him. If you don't get anywhere, take someone with you. If that doesn't do any good, take it to the elders. Sometimes there's a discipline that has to take place. And you do so out of love, because you love the individual involved. That's what 1 Corinthians chapter 5 is about. That's what 1 Timothy chapter 1 verses 19 and 20 are about. Because Paul highlighted Hymenaeus and Philetus and their particular error, and he said, I've delivered them to Satan that they might learn not to blaspheme. All right? Discipline. Discipline is necessary. Discipline is a mark of love. It's not love to ignore things of this nature. That doesn't mean brotherly love. Brotherly love does mean, very quickly, it does mean practicing the golden rule in your life. You probably know the rule, the golden rule from Matthew's account. I want to read Luke's account of it. In Luke 6:31, Luke 6:31, here it is. It's underlined in my Bible. Just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. All right, that's simple, very powerful. Applied to the previous point, which has been drawn from Hebrews 13 and verse 9, strange and diverse doctrines and all of that, and people get caught up into that. And it's not love to overlook that sort of thing. What is brotherly love? How do we practice this? Well, brotherly love is practicing the golden rule. And the golden rule, just as you want people to do to you, you do the same thing to them. So in this context, I would think that if I taught something wrong, or if somebody thought I taught something wrong, I would appreciate it if they would treat me the way that I would want to be treated. They practice the golden rule with me. If somebody thinks I'm a false teacher, I would appreciate it if they'd approach me about it, rather than write me up, rather than tag me on Facebook, put me out there for the world to see. I'd rather they had the dignity, the decency, the love to come to me and talk to me about it. Maybe they misunderstood something. Maybe I misunderstand something. Maybe I'm off on something. Maybe I need some clarification. Maybe they need some clarification. If you practice the golden rule, and the golden rule is, just as you want people to do to you, you do to them. We'd all appreciate that, and we're all on the same level as far as that goes. We know what it's like. Do we treat one another that way? That's what brotherly love is. And brotherly love is in evidence when somebody hears you preach and they're not clear on what you're saying. And they go to you and they sit down with you a few minutes and they ask you for some clarification. And you give it. And you're glad that they did and they're glad that they did. That's brotherly love in evidence, and I applaud it. It needs to be that way. That's how brotherly love is practiced in the church. Brotherly love also involves patience. We could go to 1 Corinthians 13 tonight. We could outline point by point what love is. I don't intend to do that. I will remember 1 Corinthians 13:4, that love suffers long, patient, is kind. Okay? Much more is said, but that's my point, that love suffers long. When somebody hears something and thinks something and right off the bat draws conclusions, where's patience there? Patience talks to people. Patience understands people. It bears with provocation. That's what patience is. Bearing with provocation. Forbearing with one another. That's what brethren do. That's what God intended with His church, for people to do, because people are people. And people oftentimes fail. People need to understand one another and grow with one another. So love involves patience. That's what brotherly love is in part. So brotherly love, let brotherly love continue. It reaches across the aisle to the person next to you, behind you, in front of you. Brotherly love reaches across the aisle. It reaches across the kingdom. It does little good for us to preach countless sermons on brotherly love and in theory say, yeah, that's what we believe, but in practice not to carry through with it, because the world sees our practice and the world draws conclusions for right or wrong along those lines. Sometimes you can't control that. Sometimes you can. Brotherly love, let it continue. That means it's here. It has started. It has grown. It mellows. Let it continue. Don't let hardships, trials, conflicts interrupt it. Keep it up. Keep it going. Love Jesus. Primarily, first of all, love His Word. Love the God who sent Him. So that by our love, not only do we love Him, we obey Him, we follow Him, and one day we'll stand before Him to be judged. Prepare for it now while we stand and sing to encourage you.